Thank you, Beata and Jen and Venerable Lothan Demala. It's a privilege to join you today, and especially to be hosted by the Tibet House, founded by one of my revered mentors, going back a half a lifetime for me, back to the early days when I was an undergraduate at Amherst College, Professor Robert Thurman. So thank you, all of you, for creating this wonderful institution and allowing me to speak to you about a topic that I believe is of enormous importance, whether one is Buddhist, non-Buddhist, religious, not religious. It's quite clear to me that humanity right now is facing a crisis of mental ill health. Isn't it obvious to all of us that we've seen this manifesting in dominant political figures that have arisen on our horizon, some of them still there, very much active, and doing a lot of damage? Mental ill health, mental imbalances dominating so much it goes on in business with these catastrophic inequalities of wealth distribution. And then, of course, above all, one can say may I simply say insane way that we human beings, we 7.8 billion human beings, are treating our own environment and throwing the balance of the natural world totally a kilter, such that we are sacrificing the environmental foundations for preserving human civilization as we know it. And we're not taking the necessary steps, even though science and technology, everything that needs to be done, we're not doing it. So how can that be deemed anything other than insane? Now, the dominant models of mental health, mental ill health, treating mental disease and so forth, that's become global, is entirely Eurocentric. It comes out of Eurocentric civilization, stemming from science, as if the Western model, the Eurocentric model, is the only model that's worth taking seriously. Well, the scientific study of the mind began only about 150 years ago, both therapeutically as well as simply trying to understand the nature of the mind. It's a new kid on the block, whereas Galileo was making his great discoveries more than 4 centuries ago. So it's a very young science, both in terms of understanding the nature of mind, but also identifying the root causes of mental distress, mental disorder, and how to cultivate exceptional mental mental health and well-being. Well, what I'll be sharing with you today is not really coming from or strongly influenced by the Eurocentric model. I've had essentially no training in Western psychology, so be very transparent here. But I've had about 50 years of training in Buddhist psychology, Buddhist philosophy, meditation, in multiple traditions, Theravada tradition, Indian Buddhism, all 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism. So some background there, but not just a Buddhist training, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, my root Lama, my primary spiritual mentor, has stated so frequently and emphatically, that when it comes to understanding the mind and understanding mental disease and mental health, this is not simply a religious matter. It's not Buddhism versus Hinduism versus other religions. It's really a secular matter. It's an academic matter. And what I'm drawing from here for this talk, which I'll begin very shortly now, is what His Holiness calls for short the Nalanda Tradition. This is not just referring to one university, and it was a great university, international university, but for the first millennium of the Common Era, there was a whole network of universities across India that was preserved, developed, grew and flourished for 1,000 years before the first university was established in Europe, the University of Bologna. It arose and fell, or declined, prior to the last 800, 900 years of university tradition in the West. But unlike Western universities, this 1,000 years of higher education, with Nalanda, Vikramashila, and many, many other universities, inspired by Buddhism, the Jaina tradition, multiple Indian traditions, philosophical schools, they were primarily focused on understanding the mind, understanding the inner causes of suffering, understanding the inner causes of finding freedom from suffering. So even though my talk here will look fresh, it will look novel in some respects, it's the packaging, it's the formatting, but the juice, the core, the real meaning is drawing from the insights of the Buddha himself, the Naga, asanga, dharmakirti, tsongkhapa, and so on. So I'm sharing with you this presentation of this 4 aspects of mental balance with a sense of reverence. This is not my school. This is not my view. I'm conveying in a way that I hope is contemporary and accessible understanding of the mind that is immensely profound and relevant for all 7.8 billion human beings today, whether or not we're religious, let alone whether or not we are Buddhist. So here then I would like to go to screen share, and we turn to 4 aspects of mental balance, inner balance, as you like. And I'm going to go to full screen here. Oh, maybe I have to go up here to do that. Slideshow. There we are. So 4 aspects of mental balance. Well, with the preceding comments as a preface, I wonder if somebody can tell me how to get rid of mute, stop video, and so forth, because it's blocking me from seeing my own slide. If one of you can help me to get rid of that, that would be very helpful. So I can't read the title here because it's blocked by this mute.
What's blocking it?
Mute, stop video.
There might be an X in the upper right-hand corner that you could press on. If you press on, is there an X in the upper right-hand corner?
No, it's pause recording. I would just like to get rid of that whole menu bar because this is taking up time.
Oh, I see. Unfortunately, sometimes the Zoom menu bar actually just does block.
But you see, it's blocking. I can't even see the titles of my talk.
Okay.
You can potentially move it if you.
Yeah, are you able to drag it?
If I can drag it? Okay, that did it. Down we go.
Thank you, Tom.
Innocuous. And then, thank you, and I'm going to get rid of this. Okay, that pretty well did it. But now I'm blocked on the bottom.
Are you able to drag it to the side?
Okay. Yeah, I wish we had been able to get rid of this earlier. Nope, it demands to be horizontal. So too bad we're spending our time this way, but that's the breaks. And I have all of the images of you all also blocking the script.
The images can be changed by pressing a different view icon at the top of the, so instead of gallery view, you can minimize it by, there should be just like a little dash on top of our video screens or to the side of it.
Okay.
Or if you prefer, I can screen share for you.
If you could do that, yeah, this is kind of taking up valuable time.
No problem.
If you can clean it up, I'd appreciate that.
No problem.
And then you can make it full screen. Much better, much better. Thank you. So on we go. Hopefully you're bearing in mind the prefatory comments, which are very relevant. And so I guess I now, since I have no control over my slides, so Jen, if you would advance the slide. Okay. So here we are with our Eurocentric understanding of mental disorders and genuine well-being, dominating the globe, frankly, academic institutions all over the world, and mental health as well. But we see for whatever progress has been made over the last 150 years of the scientific study of the mind, mental health, and so forth, depression remains the #1 cause of disability worldwide. So it's not just a Eurocentric problem. Eurocentric problems become global problems. But depression, in terms of its risk, is 32% higher in wealthy countries. So obviously no correspondence between increase of wealth and increase of well-being or decrease of depression. It's actually stronger, higher in the wealthy countries. And then in the United States, while the gross domestic product has increased 50 times since 1950, while in the meantime the change in well-being has been 0 and depression has increased 10 times. So that would indicate that in terms of mental health care, we're not that clear about what are the causes of depression, or for that matter, what are the causes of genuine well-being. So we turn to the next slide. The psychology of mental disorders. Well, modern psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry, neuropsychiatry. These are all based in science, which has been evolved for 300 years before the science of the mind even began, rooted in biology. And biology, of course, is massively influenced by the brilliant theory of evolution of Charles Darwin. And so the eminent and late evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould synopsizes evolution, natural selection, as he characterizes as purposeless. It's not going anywhere. Non-progressive. It's not that species are getting better, they're simply adapting to changing environments so that they can survive and procreate. And it's materialistic. Evolution is understood as having only material causes on the course of evolution, but in the physicalist understanding of the universe, the only physical phenomena have causal efficacy. So any non-physical phenomena are simply considered to be either non-existent or inert. So that's the biological bed in which psychology has grown. This coming up 150 years ago from Charles Darwin. And so then we have evolutionary psychology. Well, I've listened to a lot of this from a very eminent expert in the field. And I've been told, especially in terms of emotions, that all of our emotions have proven themselves to be biologically adaptive over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. Every emotion we have, hatred, malice, contempt, fear, anger, they are all proven themselves to be biologically adaptive. Therefore, you can't speak of any emotions being wrong because they've helped us survive and procreate. So in other words, it's a completely amoral view of the mind. We turn to positive psychology. I had the opportunity to speak with one of the shining lights, the great luminaries in positive psychology several years ago at a conference. And he gave his presentation on positive psychology, a definitive, very authoritative one. And I asked him, speaking from the audience, and what's the role for ethics in positive psychology? And his response was, there isn't one because science is value-free. It tells us what is, not what should be. Well, I find that actually, so I don't want to mention the name of this person, I don't like criticizing individuals, but the view that science is value-free has never been true. Not from the time of Copernicus, who was a churchman, Galileo, devout Christian, and the list goes on and on. Kepler and Newton, all devout Christians, all the way up to James Clerk Maxwell in the 19th century. Science was embedded in the ethics of Christianity, and for the last 150 years or so, then it's been embedded in the values of physicalism, of scientific materialism. That is not value-free. And so, okay, science tells us what is, but not what should be. But what if a person says, I would like to be mentally healthy, what should I do? Then the psychotherapist could probably tell you, this is reality. If you do this, this will happen. And that would be called giving advice, because the person's coming to you with a yearning to be more healthy mentally. So I find this a very inadequate and misleading response. When it comes to clinical psychology, and I have engaged in many, many conversations with a wide variety of clinical psychologists, listening carefully, what I've heard is that it's common practice to conflate the symptoms of mental disorders with their underlying causes. So depression is considered to be a disorder. Well, from a Buddhist perspective, it's not a disorder, it's a symptom. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a symptom. Insomnia is a symptom. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, a symptom. Anxiety is a symptom. None of these are disorders. And so we know there's cancer and then there are the symptoms of a different kind of cancer. But if you conflate the two and you treat the symptoms and think at the same time you're treating the actual disorders themselves that cause the symptoms, then your therapy is bound to be quite superficial. And the causes, when it comes to causes of mental disorders, like depression, anxiety, and so forth, overwhelmingly, from what I've heard as an outsider, they look outwards to trauma, to your childhood, to your work environment, to the environment, physical. They're looking outwards for the causes of mental disorders in one's social and physical environment. Well, from a Buddhist perspective, certainly the social and physical environment act as contributing conditions that may trigger mental disorders and mental distress, depression, and so forth. but the primary causes are not to be found outside. So at this point, after we've had more than a century of development of psychotherapy, Eurocentric psychotherapy, we have something, I just read an article today, 250 schools of psychotherapy. They fundamentally differ in a myriad of ways, both theoretically and practically or therapeutically. And there's no research done to show that one is better than another, because all the research winds up being biased. And so there is simply no uniformity there at all. And while we have this plethora of so many diverse ways of trying to understand mental disease and how to treat it, in the meantime, to this day, mental diseases and suicides continue to be on the rise. So this does not look like a great success, but rather very problematic. That's for psychology, but how about the neuroscience of mental disorders, to which we turn to the next slide. So from the beginnings of the academic discipline of neuroscience in the 1960s, one of the pioneers of the growth and development of this discipline was the neuropsychiatrist Eric Kandel, a very eminent figure in neuroscience and neuropsychiatry. And he writes here, just 9 years ago, I'll read it briefly, can't linger too long on any slide. Our understanding of the biology of mental disorders has been slow in coming, but recent advances like these have shown us that mental disorders are biological in nature, that people are not responsible for having schizophrenia or depression, and that individual biology and genetics make significant contributions. The brain is a complex biological organ possessing immense computational capability. It constructs our sensory experience, regulates our thoughts and emotions, and controls our actions. It is responsible not only for relatively simple motor behaviors like running and eating, but also for complex acts that we consider quintessentially human, like thinking, speaking, and creating works of art. Looked at from this perspective, our mind is a set of operations carried out by the brain. The same principle of unity applies to mental disorders. This is basically the catechism of the mind sciences. The mind is what the brain does. And this was something agreed upon quite universally in this discipline of neuroscience from its inception in the 1960s. Let us simply assume the mind is what the brain does. Mental disorders are simply brain disorders. And now let's go about and prove this to be true. In other words, it's faith-based. But he's saying this is evidence-based, slow in coming, but they have shown mental disorders are biological nature. In other words, sheer brazen reductionism. Well, we've had, certainly since the 1950s, 70 years by now, to put that hypothesis to the test of actual experience and not leave it simply as an article of faith. So Stephen E. Hyman, the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States, he's written just 1 year later, pharmacology gives doctors more drugs to use, allowing millions of people to reduce their symptoms. Yet the overall impact of this drug revolution on public health has been mixed, and decades of research on the drug's mechanisms, on serotonin, for example, the target of antidepressant drugs like Prozac, has taught scientists nothing about the causes of mental illness. So what is presented as evidence-based by Professor Eric Kandel is actually faith-based. And that faith has been utterly repudiated by decades of development with the collusion of neuroscientists and the pharmaceutical industry, making billions and billions of dollars through the sale of psychopharmaceutical drugs, and has taught them nothing about the origins of mental disease, and moreover, a fact that is plain, because I've confirmed this many times, there is not one psychopharmaceutical drug that cures even a single mental disease. They are only basically anesthesia. They're painkillers. But not a single one is actually getting to the roots. If they were, then these drugs would actually cure you of depression. You wouldn't have to take antidepressants indefinitely. So I must say I find something quite fraudulent here, profoundly misleading, and of great ill service to humanity, when psychiatrists administer drugs and tell their patients this is medicine. This is misleading, because these are just painkillers. It's like going to a cancer ward and giving everybody morphine and saying this is medicine. It's not. it's not even addressing the underlying causes of cancer, in this case, not even addressing the underlying causes, which remain a mystery of mental disease. Next slide, please. So here's a comment by His Holiness made just a couple of years ago in an online conversation dialogue, and I'll read what he said verbatim. And I translated this because it was not fully translated at that time. But I was listening to Tibetan. I've translated before and before. This, I think, is a definitive translation of what he actually said. He says, in my recent conversation with scientists, I have found that they have conducted excellent investigations in the nature of the objective physical world, but the Western science of psychology is at a primitive level. They're not able to distinguish between sensory modes of consciousness and the mind, or mental consciousness, and neuroscientists who present sophisticated explanations of the brain say that the many kinds of conceptualization of the mind are all functions of specific parts of the brain. So contemporary psychology is not up to the task. In general, classical Indian academia's emphasis on nonviolence and compassion is related to the mind. About 2,000 years ago, single-pointed shamatha, highly focused attention, and vipassana, investigating nature of mind and its role in nature, were used to develop discerning intelligence. Shamatha and vipassana being the core of Buddhist meditation in all schools. Nowadays, the physical sciences are quite good, unlike the mind sciences. These are not religious matters, but academic topics for the sake of increasing our knowledge, and Buddhist texts are an excellent resource from which scientists could greatly benefit. So unfortunately, the mind sciences have been dominated since the rise of behaviorism more than a century ago by the metaphysical beliefs, the articles of faith of physicalism, that everything that exists consists of configurations of matter and energy and their emergent properties. This is a fundamental article of faith. It's not scientific. It's never been proven scientifically. It's simply assuming science is the only way to understand the whole of reality, and the only thing science is good at is examining the objective, physical, and quantifiable world. So physicalism is to science what fundamentalism is to religion. Fundamentalism is not religious. Physicalism is not scientific. In fact, it's parasitic on science and limits the imagination of scientists to think that they have to think inside this box, otherwise they're not being scientific, just like fundamentalism limits the imagination of religious people. So they feel they can't think outside of the box of their own fundamentalist beliefs, unquestioned articles of faith. So it's a very sad parallel to see when scientists are following the footsteps of the worst of religion. Next slide, please. So this raises, as we're addressing the issue of mental health and well-being, of mental ill health, why don't we just take the bull by the horns and ask, what's the purpose of life? And so I cite, first of all, one of my great intellectual heroes, Albert Einstein. He's not only, of course, a brilliant physicist, but a very, very thoughtful philosopher. And he commented, and I quote, "Well-being and happiness never appear to me as an absolute aim. I'm even inclined to compare such moral aims to the ambitions of a pig. And that is, if you think the highest goal, the greatest good I could possibly accomplish is to be happy, well, if a pig could talk, that's what a pig would say. I want more food, I want more sex, I want to have a comfortable place to relax and have fun." And that's what hedonists say. So there's one view. The purpose of life really has nothing to do with well-being and happiness, something else. On the other hand, His Holiness Dalai Lama has commented, "I believe that the very purpose of our life is to seek happiness. Whether one believes in religion or not, whether one believes in this religion or that religion, we all are seeking something better in life. So I think the very motion of our life is towards happiness." So these two statements by brilliant men seem diametrically opposed. One just short phrase that I'd like to highlight here. We're all seeking something better in life. And I invite you to reflect upon this personally. Are you satisfied to simply survive and procreate and say, job done, I'm successful, I've had kids? Are you satisfied? Is anybody satisfied? Just say, I'm successful from an evolutionary perspective, an amoral, materialistic, purposeless, directionless perspective. My life is meaningful, I've had kids. Well, no, we're not. Very few people are. We want something better, something more. And the question is, what more? More wealth, more power, more better reputation? Again, physicalism limits our imagination, throws us into an imagination deficit disorder. If that's all we think of, when we think of something more, is more of the same. Next slide, please. So I would suggest that Albert Einstein and His Holiness, in fact, are not in conflict here, because they're speaking of two different types of pleasure or happiness. The first, this is a direct translation from Tibetan, mundane pleasure. Mundane pleasure, the whole bandwidth of pleasure that's derived from encountering pleasant stimuli, whether by way of the physical senses, it could be aesthetic, it could be intellectual, it could be also pleasant stimuli by drinking alcohol or taking drugs, legal or illegal drugs. That's a direct stimulus to your brain. So any kind of pleasure that arises in response to pleasant stimuli, biochemical or social or aesthetic or interpersonal and so forth, that's a kind of mundane pleasure. And mundane pleasure entails the avoidance of unpleasant stimuli, whether physical or mental. So mundane pleasure is something we pursue, often by way of the acquisition of wealth, acquisition of power, acquisition of reputation, status, and prestige. It's something we pursue and that we get from the world. By pursuing it, we go out and hunt in the world to find things that we feel will make us happy, and then we gather it in and hold on for dear life. And if anybody obstructs us, then we respond with anger. Well, we have that entirely in common with animals. On the other hand, the great sages of the East and West, going back to, in the Western tradition, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, back to Zhuangzi, back to the Buddha himself, back to Saint Augustine, and so on, in the religious traditions of the world, the great philosophical traditions of the world, and more recently in positive psychology, there's exploration, some of it going on for millennia, of another whole dimension of happiness that we can call genuine well-being. And this is a quality of well-being or happiness that is not dependent upon pleasurable stimuli, but is rather derived from what we bring to the world, such as the satisfaction, the joy, the contentment that comes from living an ethical way of life, rooted in nonviolence and benevolence. The kind of well-being that arises from cultivating mental balance, mental health, mental well-being inwardly. And the deepest is the kind of genuine well-being that arises from wisdom, coming to know reality as it is. I don't think that Einstein would say that is the ambition of a pig, because it's not. It's something that we human beings can distinctively strive for, cultivate, not pursue, cultivate. And I'll make a very strong statement here. Right now, we 7.8 billion people on the planet, as a group, overall, we are seeking happiness by looking outside, which is by nature competitive, which by nature then gives rise to violence. Whereas if we would shift our priorities in accordance with the wisdom traditions of the world, St. Thomas Aquinas, Buddha, Buddhaghosa, and so forth and so on, and see, the whole point of mundane pleasure, the whole point of the pursuit of mundane pleasure is for the sake of cultivating genuine well-being. So our pursuit of food, clothing, shelter, medical care, education, good. But what's it for? Just material success? Or is it all a prelude to cultivating genuine well-being? This is something we bring to the world, not something we get from it, and it's by nature non-competitive. Next slide, please. As there are two types of happiness known to the great wisdom traditions in religion, philosophy, and now science, I would suggest there are also two types of unhappiness. The first one we're all very familiar with. Something made me unhappy. Another person, a situation, my health got worse, I lost my money, there's a war, something happens, and then we respond with unhappiness. We all know that. It's very familiar. And then we think, how can I get rid of this unhappiness? By fixing whatever out there that stimulated or aroused my unhappiness. So we go around trying to fix the world. Fix the world. As Professor Thurman has commented, there are two ways of trying to find happiness. One is by fixing the world. And the other is by cultivating your own mind. And he's commented, it's like treating the earth as you just something you patch over with leather, like a baseball. And whenever there's something that makes you unhappy, you patch it over, patch it over. And it's an endless task because the world keeps on being annoying. Whereas if you cultivate your own mind, then you don't have to fix the world for your own sake. You may want to help the world, but you can be content, you can find genuine well-being, even if the world is awry. Genuine unhappiness is a quality of unhappiness, of discontent, of malaise, dissatisfaction, feeling ill at ease, which you cannot point to any stimulus that gave you that genuine unhappiness. Because it's symptomatic of a mind that is dominated by such mental afflictions as greed, hatred, and delusion. In other words, you can sit quietly in a room all by yourself with no unpleasant stimuli coming in, not even necessarily having unhappy thoughts come up. But insofar as your mind is dominated by these kleshas, these mental afflictions, such as greed, hatred, and delusion, when you're just sitting there quietly with no stimuli coming in that are positive, negative, you'll feel genuine unhappiness. And that's interesting. Because you must know then, this isn't something that just happened to you. This is an unhappiness you're bringing to the world, to your relationships, to your work, to your family. It's not coming from outside. Next slide, please. I would like to comment here that there are three dimensions, or propose there are three dimensions of human flourishing, or genuine well-being. And the first of these is directly associated with and arises from leading an ethical way of life. And although there are myriad systems of ethics, I think common ground among every meaningful system of ethics is nonviolence and benevolence. And if we lead our lives in accordance with these principles, an ethical way of life, then from this comes a sense of social flourishing, social well-being in our interaction with other human beings and other sentient beings on the planet. But also if we're treating the environment in a nonviolent and benevolent way, then we can environmentally flourish. We're not doing so. We human beings are destroying our environment, undermining human civilization. And why? Lack of ethics. We're treating the world with violence. On the basis of that, then there's another whole dimension of genuine well-being or flourishing that stems from mental balance. So for those of you familiar with the Buddhism, we have Shila, Samadhi, Prajna. This is Samadhi. This is the unification of the mind, the cultivation of exceptional mental balance and well-being through the cultivation of the mind. So even when you're in solitude, maybe sustained solitude, you don't feel lonely, you don't feel agitated, depressed, anxious, and so forth. In the solitude where you're simply present with your own mind, surrounded perhaps by nature, you can experience a wellspring of mental or psychological flourishing as a symptom of a very well-balanced and refined mind, in which mental health and balance have been cultivated to a high degree. And finally, the culminating dimension. This is quite universal knowledge. We find this in St. Augustine, for example, and in the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition, the Taoist tradition. The highest degree, dimension of well-being or human flourishing stems from wisdom. It stems from knowing reality as it is. Knowing the meaning of your life, the meaning of existence, the nature of mind. So three dimensions. And there's a hierarchy here. Ethics is foundational. On that basis, mental balance. On that basis, the cultivation of wisdom, insight, vipassana. So we turn to the next slide. So three dimensions, and now to elaborate just a little bit and very briefly. Social environmental flourishing. How can we live in harmony with other people and the environment at large? Well, this is harmony with family, communities, nations, and international relations, all rooted in nonviolence and benevolence. So we see the massive discord, the tragedies, the terrible human cost of misery, destruction of people's homes and their cities and so forth. Why? Because of violence. No ethics. Leaders who are leading with no ethics. It's clear. In terms of environmental harmony with the ecosphere, maintaining a sustainable economy without environment degradation. Why are we destroying the balance in our natural world? Lack of ethics. This entails a harmonious balance of unity and diversity, a theme that comes through ecology, which is the other career that I might have pursued had I not encountered Buddhism. Unity, yes, but also celebrating diversity. But the unity being underlying and even more important. And finally, it stems from such environmental flourishing, social flourishing stems from ethical balance, again, based on the principles of nonviolence and benevolence. Believe whatever you like, but this is core ethics. Whether you're an atheist or a theist or a non-theist, this is the core, I believe, of ethics that all ethical people can and should embrace. We move to the next slide. Psychological flourishing. This is a quality, a sense of well-being that's not contingent on external or internal stimuli and is qualified by serenity, joy, and contentment rather than excitement and arousal. And it derives, I would argue here, from 4 types of mental balance. Cognitive, having to do with our desires, our values, aspirations, goals. Attentional, clear. Cognitive, how we apprehend the world. And finally, emotional balance. These are the 4 types of balance that can be cultivated, giving rise to an ever-deepening sense of mental well-being, of psychological flourishing. Next slide, please. So now to unpack, but briefly, because time is short, running by quickly. Cognitive, again, conation is not a household term, and everybody knows, but everybody should know it. Because conation is what drives our lives, our desires, aspirations, goals, ideals, our intentions. And so when it comes to conation, there may be a cognitive deficit where people lose vision, they lose any real desire for happiness because they've given up. It's an apathetic loss of desire for happiness causes, because people have a sense they don't know how to do it, they give up. And they just fall into apathy. There's cognitive hyperactivity, there's too much desire, obsessive desire, that obscures the reality of the present. And then there's cognitive dysfunction, where we're desiring things that if we achieve them, it would not be conducive to our own or others' well-being. Addiction is the classic case of a cognitive dysfunction. One desperately wants the alcohol, the drug, the gambling, the sex, and so forth, and it gives rise only to misery. Next slide, please. So you've seen the pattern here. I'll just linger here on the last slide, but at this point, deficit, hyperactivity, and dysfunction. This, I've had actually years of exposure to traditional Tibetan medicine, and when speaking of different psychophysiological constitutions, drawing from the earlier Indian Ayurvedic tradition of the 3 humors, Vata, Pitta, Kapha in Sanskrit, wind, bile, phlegm, there's tremendous explanatory power here that I've seen manifesting in Tibetan medicine in practice. But for each of these 3, wind, bile, and phlegm, you are in a state of imbalance if there's too much, too little, or a malfunction of any of the 3, or combination of any of those 3. And then you're ill. I took that principle from Indian Ayurvedic and later to traditional Tibetan medicine and I applied it to the mind. Conation, too much, too little, and dysfunctional. Each of these will make you feel ill. How do we cultivate cognitive intelligence? Well, here's one approach. There are many, many, many. But I've taught this for years now, to set out on a vision quest of our own individually, and simply ask of ourselves, in the depths of our hearts, what would truly make you happy? What would really bring you happiness, contentment, a sense of fulfillment that's sustainable? And envision it. Set out on your vision quest. Until a vision comes to mind. What would really make you happy? Fulfilled, content, and not just for a day or two. Something sustainable. And once a vision like that comes to mind, then pose a second question. What would you love to receive from the world to help you find such well-being? You can't do this on your own. So envision, what would you love to receive from those near and far, short-term, long-term, so that you can find the happiness that is your heart's desire. But of course, it's not enough to have help from outside. This leads to the third question: how would you love to transform and mature inwardly in order to realize such well-being? So from what limitations, defects, problems would you love to be free? And with what virtues, what qualities, noble qualities would you love to be richly endowed to become the person you would love to become, so that you can realize the happiness you would love to experience? Third question. And finally, no man, no woman is an island. None of us exist independently. So envision our own well-being as separate from, independent of everybody else is delusional. So given the interconnectedness of ourselves with everyone around us, human, non-human, and so on, then we ask the fourth question, in order to lead the most meaningful life, fulfilling life, the happiest life possible, what would you love to offer to the world? And envision it. Children can pose, you can pose these questions to children, religious people, non-religious. It might bring insight and mature us in developing cognitive intelligence. Go to the next slide. There is a sequence here, and it's first cognitive. So the sequence is important. Conation is motivation. But once you're motivated, you have your aspiration, your desire, then you need to stay focused. And so this raises the issue of attention. On that basis, cognition, and on that basis, emotion. The sequence is actually very important. What attentional imbalances are there? Well, this is how I first began to come up with this fourfold model that since then has expanded to a sixfold model, but I won't go there right now. We have our hands full. Attentional imbalances, well, these are familiar. Attention deficit disorder. It entails a loss of clarity and vividness of attention. You're spacing out. The mind is vague, dull, unclear. We all know what that's like. Attention hyperactivity, translated from Buddhism, excitation, where you're involuntarily, your attention is so agitated, distracted by compulsive desires, you can't stay focused. There's no continuity of your attention. That's an imbalance. And then, beyond ADHD, there's attentional dysfunction, where we're attending to whatever we're focusing on, perhaps with stability and vividness, but we're doing so in a dysfunctional, afflictive, harmful way. I'll give just one example. Men who take a predatory approach to viewing women as objects of their own gratification. Attractive, unattractive, boring. And then pursue them for their own ends. Well, you may be attending to that woman. Women can do this to men too, of course. I think maybe a bit more common among men. Where we're attending to half the human species in a dysfunctional, frankly, degenerate way of viewing them as merely objects. It's dehumanizing. It's dysfunctional. Something to be overcome. It's not healthy. We go to the next slide, please. How to cultivate attentional intelligence, attentional balance. Look to India here. I mean, save yourself a lot of time. Don't look to the Greeks or the Egyptians or the Jews or even early China with all its richness. India invented samadhi. The Indic culture invented samadhi. Developed thousands of years ago extremely sophisticated methods for cultivating mindfulness, which is not simply being here now in a non-judgmental way. That's frankly, a New Age definition. Mindfulness in the Buddhist tradition is the faculty of being able to bear in mind what we're focusing on without forgetfulness or distraction. It's a bearing in mind of voluntary attention. Whether it's to a lecturer's speech, or to your breathing, or to a business plan, or a piece of art you're working on, or poetry you're composing. Mindfulness is that ability to bear in mind. That is monitored with a faculty of introspection by which we are able to recognize, to observe the various processes taking place in our minds, including the occurrence of excitation and laxity, attention hyperactivity and deficit, recognizing the internally, and then applying remedies to rebalance your attention, sustain your mindfulness. These are qualities that can be cultivated to extraordinary degrees, and in the West we've hardly even begun. In India, this is a 5,000-year-old discipline. Among first the pre-Buddhist swamis, the yogis, the rishis, and then in Buddhism for 2,600 years, and the Indic tradition has flowed into Taoism, East Asian Buddhism, Chan and Zen, and so forth and so on. In the West, we've hardly even begun. The result of cultivating mindfulness and introspection, for example, by way of mindfulness of breathing, the result of this is a quality of body and mind, of relaxation, of stability, when it comes to attention is continuity, and vividness of attention. And there are dozens and dozens of methods in Buddhism alone for developing mindfulness and introspection as means to cultivating samadhi. And that is a unification of the mind, a total focus, the opposite of multitasking, sustained with mindfulness introspection. Relaxation, stability, and vividness in sequence, each of these supporting the latter. We move on to the next slide. Cognitive, and then attentional, and then cognitive. There are cognitive imbalances. A cognitive deficit, and Buddhist epistemology has an enormous amount to say here, with tremendous depth. We're experiencing a cognitive deficit when we fail to perceive what is present in the 6 fields of experience, that is, including mental experience. That is, reality is presenting something to us by way of our 5 physical senses or our faculty of mental perception, by which we're able to observe our emotions, mental images, our desires, whether the mind is distracted or whether it's focused, our memories, our fantasies. 6 fields of experience. The 6th one is not occult, the 6th sense. It's something we all have and largely ignored in modern psychology. Mental perception. So something is presented. It could be our emotion. It could be a mental image, a memory. It could be something visual or auditory. It's presenting and we don't see it. We don't see it. It's right there, manifest, evident, and we don't see it. Why? Because there's a cognitive bias, a cognitive blockage, probably conceptual. We see it and we don't see it. We hear it, but we don't hear it. Emotions are arising, we're unaware of them. Have you ever experienced cognitive deficit? Cognitive hyperactivity is just the opposite, where there's a conflation of conceptual projections with perceptual experience. So reality is dishing up from moment to moment appearances to all of our 6 senses, 5 sensory, 1 mental. That's what reality is dishing up from moment to moment. Another person's voice, the appearances, our thoughts, our emotions. But then we superimpose upon these 6 fields of perception our preconceptions, our expectations, our biases, our prejudices. And it drowns out what reality is experiencing. We may not even pick up reality, so it leads to a cognitive deficit, or we conflate what reality is presenting with what we're projecting, and we can't even tell the difference. This is a sign of schizophrenia. This is a sign of mental illness when it's extreme. You can't tell the difference between the intersubjective reality of the people around you and yourself with the concoctions of your own mind. You can't tell the difference. It's a sign of insanity when it's extreme. But aren't all of us, or at least most of us, at least a little bit insane on occasion? And then finally, cognitive dysfunction. This results in distorted perceptual and or conceptual ways of viewing reality. And I will suggest that this occurs because we are not seeing what reality is presenting from moment to moment, and we're not conflating it. We are not seeing, that is, we are seeing what reality is dishing up from moment to moment, and we're not superimposing on that and conflating our projections. We're seeing what is there and not seeing what's not there. In other words, we're in tune with reality. But dysfunction, the malfunctioning of our cognitive apprehension of reality, I suggest comes from editing out things unconsciously, superimposing things unconsciously, and then it's an alloy of this concocted sense of reality that is derivative of not seeing what's there and seeing what's not there. Next slide, please. Buddhism has tremendous wealth, going back to the teachings of the Buddha himself, on how to develop cognitive intelligence, such as the foundational teachings on vipassana in the Buddha's great discourse on the 4 close applications of mindfulness, applying discerning, intelligent mindfulness with introspection, applying mindfulness to our own and others' bodies and physical phenomena at large, our own and others' feelings, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, human and animal, our own and others' mental states, our own we can directly perceive, others we can infer by way of what they say, how they act, their facial expressions, and so forth. And finally, closely applying mindfulness to phenomena at large, especially those aspects of reality that can take us towards the path of liberation, of mental health and well-being, and away from mental illness. Foundational vipassana in the whole of the Buddhist tradition. With such discerning mindfulness, we identify which mental processes are conducive and which are detrimental to our own and others' genuine well-being. This is through exploration, this is through investigation, using mental perception imbued with intelligence. And then finally, when we see what is detrimental, then we counteract harmful mental processes and we cultivate beneficial ones. This is intelligent mindfulness. This is Buddhist mindfulness that is rooted in ethics and oriented towards greater and greater mental well-being. Next slide, please. And then finally, emotional. If you've cultivated a high degree of cognitive intelligence, attentional intelligence, cognitive intelligence, I would suggest that emotional balance will come per force of all of the previous three. It'll come like icing on the cake. But there are emotional imbalances, you see the same format. And these themes are very well known by affective psychologists. Emotional deficit, this is all familiar, isn't it? An affective deadness within, you're not even aware of your own emotions. And then that turns outwardly to a cold indifference to other people, to events. Emotional deficit. Emotional hyperactivity, gyrating back and forth between elation and depression, in extreme cases being bipolar. Oscillating back and forth between hope and fear, towards other people, adulation and contempt, towards other people, situations, institutions, attachment and anger. So all polarizations and fluctuations back and forth, hyperactivity. And finally, there are emotional dysfunctions, such as, and one of many, 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 just general, inappropriate emotional responses to situations. I'll give a classic one. The Germans have a term for it. Schadenfreude, taking delight in other people's misfortune. It's an emotion, but it's unethical. It's a kind of violence, and certainly in absence of benevolence, it's malevolence. It's a malevolent emotion. And although there may be many emotions that are conducive to our survival and procreation, they may be actually detrimental to our happiness, even mundane happiness, let alone genuine well-being. So this is where ethics come in. We are not just products of mindless, purposeless, materialistic evolutionary biology. Evolution. It's a brilliant theory. But to say that's all there is to human existence is an indication of a very profound and tragic imagination deficit disorder. We turn to the next slide. How can we cultivate emotional intelligence? Greater and greater emotional resilience, emotional balance, emotional wisdom. Well, I turn to a matrix of meditations that were there in Patanjali in the Hindu tradition. We find it in foundational teachings, in the Buddha's own teachings, in the Pali Canon, and running through all of Buddhism. They're called the four Brahma Viharas, the four divine abodes. They're called the four immeasurables. In sequence, loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and impartiality. Cultivate these four, and you will be cultivating greater and greater emotional intelligence, emotional balance. But each of these has a false facsimile. A false facsimile of empathetic joy is hedonism. I don't mean by this something vulgar for really crude people, not only, but just a fixation on the pursuit of mundane pleasure. So when we find ourselves just again and again focused on the outside, oh, what will people think of me? How can I get more wealth? How can I get more influence? How can people love me more? Blah, 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 blah. How can we remedy this cognitive unintelligence of hedonism with loving kindness, which is not simply feeling friendly or a warm and cuddly feeling. It's an aspiration that we and others around us may find happiness and its causes, both mundane and genuine. But if you're really identifying the causes of happiness, then you'll see hedonism is a dead end and generally leads to tragedy. Aloof indifference is impartiality that's gone off. It's like gotten rotten. We can remedy aloof indifference with compassion, which again is not simply a sentiment or a feeling or an emotion. It's an aspiration, it's cognitive. May we all find freedom from suffering and its causes. And when we are aware of the suffering of others and we arouse the aspiration, may we all be free, because they experience suffering just like I do, then, of course, aloof indifference is gone. Depression is what happens to compassion when it goes astray. We just fall into despair. But we can remedy depression with empathetic joy, taking delight in others' joys, their successes, their virtues. For that matter, taking delight in our own. Depression is banished. That's getting to the root, not drugs, not just finding a better neighborhood. It's cultivating the mind to overcome depression, which is of the mind. And finally, self-centered attachment is loving kindness gone astray, where it's all about me. How can we remedy that? Self-centered attachment and aversion with impartiality. Not cold, aloof, but impartially viewing others with unconditional love and kindness and compassion, unconditionally caring for others as we care for ourselves. All of these will definitely give rise to greater emotional intelligence, emotional well-being. We turn to the next slide. I've seen, as a translator, I've been translating for about 48 years by now, a really unfortunate, profoundly misleading translation of the Buddhist term klesha. Klesha, by definition in Buddhist psychology, is a mental process that has the effect of disrupting the balance or equilibrium of the mind. It disturbs the mind, throws the mind into a state of imbalance. Klesha. So unfortunately, very misleading, this wonderful term is often translated as afflictive emotion, negative emotion, destructive emotion. But as you see from this listing from classic Buddhist psychology, most kleshas are not emotional. So to think that kleshas are only emotional, destructive and so forth, it shows either you don't know what the word emotion means, or you don't know even the first thing about Buddhist psychology. Here's a classic list. 6 primary mental afflictions. You can just look through them. You can have the slides afterward. They're now in the public domain. But 6 primary mental afflictions, you see, only one is emotional. The others are cognitive or conative. Ignorance is not an emotion, for heaven's sakes. Those are the 6 primary mental afflictions. And then we have 20 in Buddhist classical psychology, 20 subsidiary or derivative mental afflictions. And these, you see, again, only a minority of them are emotional. They include cognitive, and attentional. And so mental afflictions come in these 4 varieties. And these mental afflictions, they are the actual causes of all types of mental imbalance. The 6 primary are the causes of all the 20 derivative. The primary and derivative are the causes of the 4 types of mental imbalance: cognitive, attentional, cognitive, and emotional. And then the symptoms are things like depression and anxiety and ADHD and post-traumatic stress disorder. These are symptoms of derivative mental afflictions, which are derivative of the primary ones. And if you want to make a shorter list than 6, just go for greed, hatred, and delusion. Everything else is derivative. So we see in modern Eurocentric psychology, we're taking symptoms that are actually tertiary and equating them with the cause, which is delusional. So psychology becomes delusional, then psychology becomes a source, clinical psychology, neuropsychiatry becomes a cause, a contributing condition for mental illness. True or not? Investigate it for yourself. Next slide, please, as we're just about to wrap up. So this leads to a matrix of mental balance. I've been working on this 4-fold matrix for about 20 years, over the last year and a half, expanding this to include also the ethical coming in right between cognitive and attentional, and the culminating form of mental balance is spiritual, and that would come after the emotional. But as Paul Ekman and I, going way back to about year 2002, as we're developing the 42-hour program, 42-hour training program of Cultivating Emotional Balance, the 5-week residential program of cultivating teachers training and cultivating emotional balance, during all that development, where Paul contributed from the side of modern psychology, I from the contemplative, philosophical, psychological tradition of Buddhism, I limited myself to 4. So for this talk, in the context of cultivating emotional balance, I'll limit again to 4. So we see for each of these 4, again, please do bear in mind the sequence: cognitive, then attentional, then cognitive, then emotional. That this spectrum covers the whole bandwidth from debilitating schizophrenia or psychosis to the most sublime well-being of an arhat or a great bodhisattva, an Arya bodhisattva or a Buddha. It covers the whole bandwidth. It's not just a way of understanding mental disorders. It makes no clear, sharp demarcation between mental health and mental ill health because it's a smooth spectrum. And all of us, if you're not yet an arhat or an Arya bodhisattva, we're experiencing this from moment to moment throughout the course of the day. So in the spectrum, there's optimal. What's optimal? What would be the optimal dimension of cognitive wisdom intelligence? And likewise for each of the four, there's optimal, and then the three types of imbalances: deficit, hyperactivity, and dysfunctional. There are causes. In terms of contributing causes for all four of these, sometimes what catalyzes the cognitive imbalance is social and environmental. Sometimes what catalyzes it is physiological. Sometimes what catalyzes is our own behavior, not just the behavior of other people. And then, of course, there's psychological. And that's where you're going to find the primary causes. Always. The primary causes are psychological. The other three may or may not contribute. So this is true for all four. And in terms of meditations, well, I've run through these. I'll be very quick now. There's a fourfold one possibility for cultivating greater emotional intelligence, wisdom, developing reality-based aspirations and ideals, is by returning to that fourfold vision of flourishing, of genuine well-being. When it comes to the attentional, shamatha, the cultivation of samadhi, which if you look in the Christian tradition, it's rich. The Hindu tradition, the mother of all. The Taoist tradition, coming from India, I believe. And then a Buddhist tradition, of course. Cultivation of shamatha, cultivation of samadhi. Cognitive, I'm drawing primarily again from the foundational practices of the close application of mindfulness, foundational vipassana. This is contemplative science. Cultivation of attention is contemplative technology. Cultivating mindfulness, introspection, and samadhi. But the applications of mindfulness are the sake of cultivating insight and wisdom. And then finally, for the emotional, I'll come right back to the cultivation of these four sublime virtues of the heart: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and impartiality. There are treatments. And this is, you can see, this is open to anyone. You don't have to be Buddhist. You don't have to be religious, theistic or non-theistic. This is just a selection from the Buddhist tradition that everyone could practice to their great benefit. This is a matrix, a way of envisioning the whole spectrum from debilitating mental disorders to the most sublime mental well-being. We turn to the next slide. I spoke of social and environmental flourishing through ethics, psychological flourishing through cultivating mental balance in four ways, and finally, and moving beyond the psychological, spiritual, asking the deepest questions. For a Christian and for a theist, it's the nature of God. In the Buddhist tradition, nature of reality. What are the true causes of well-being and of suffering? What's the nature of human identity? Who are we? What's the meaning of our life? What's the nature of mind? What's the role of mind in nature? What is the meaning of existence? And by cultivating spiritual flourishing, there arises a quality of well-being that carries through all the vicissitudes of living and dying. Living, aging, sickness, and death. You can sustain it through all of that. And it derives from, well, knowing ourselves, knowing our relationship to the universe, the meaning of existence. It is liberation through insight, or to quote Jesus, it is the truth that makes you free. And that theme runs through all of the great wisdom traditions of the world. The final well-being, the deepest well-being, the most sustainable, rooted in the very nature of reality itself, is spiritual well-being. Knowing reality as it is. Come to the final slide and we're done. Conclusions. Genuine happiness or genuine well-being is cultivated following classic Buddhist training, but applicable for everybody, by way of ethics, foundational, cultivation of mental balance, and finally wisdom. There's no point in meditating if you're leading an unethical way of life. Your violent, malevolent way of life will undermine anything you do in meditation or cultivating in the mind. And one may be seeking mystical experiences, knowledge of God, nirvana, pristine awareness, primordial consciousness, Buddhahood. You may be practicing in Buddhism, stage regeneration, completion, Mahamudra Dzogchen, and so forth, the most esoteric, the most advanced practices. But if you're bringing to that a mind that is basically mentally unbalanced, psychologically imbalanced, you're not going to be able to sustain any of your insights, none of your realizations, let alone if you think there's a shortcut by taking drugs. You may have some very interesting, maybe some very meaningful experiences by taking drugs. Maybe so. Not for me to contest. Are they sustainable? Without having cultivated mental balance, without having that rooted in an ethical way of life? Forget about it. It's not a path. They're just experiences that come and go. And so this integrated mental health is cultivated by cognitive, attentional, cognitive, and emotional balance, rooted in ethics, and perfected by spiritual flourishing. An exceptional mental balance is the basis for knowing reality as it is and leading a meaningful and fulfilling life. This is the midsection that's often glossed over or skipped in Buddhist meditation. Immediately going for vipassana, immediately going for Zen, immediately going for realization of Buddha nature, or stage of regeneration, completion, Mahamudra Dzogchen, and bringing all of one's mental imbalances along for the ride. I'm sorry if we skip that medium ethics, samadhi, wisdom. If we skip, overlook, marginalize the cultivation of exceptional mental health and balance, then whatever spiritual insights, mystical realizations will not be sustainable, and they will not be ultimately transformative. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Perhaps a little bit provocative. I'm not asking anybody to agree with me, but I am saying that the wellspring from which what I've shared with you springs forth is not only the teachings of the Buddha, but 1,000 years of the Nalanda tradition in India, focusing centrally on the mind, inner causes of dukkha, and the causes of well-being, and the path to liberation. I hope this was meaningful for you. I always love immersing my mind in these profound topics. And so then we have a bit of time, maybe even 20 minutes, for discussion. And I invite reflections, your own comments. If you see that I've made some incorrect statement, I'm happy to be corrected. So this is not just question and answer, time for discussion. I would love to listen to you, and I'll respond to the best of my ability.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wallace. So Losang Tempala is kind enough to help moderate our Q&A. So if you'd like to ask questions in the chat box, please do. Thank you.
Well, Lama Allen, the first question here is from Claudia, and she's asking, can Lama Allen elaborate a bit more on the fourfold vision quest, please? Thank you.
It's something that I have composed. So you won't find this anywhere outside of teachings that I've given and the people passing it on. So it's original in that sense. But it's old wine in new wineskins, to use a Christian analogy. The Buddha himself said, find what truly makes you happy and then cultivate it. Those are his words. The Buddha himself drew the distinction between mundane and genuine well-being, the latter to be cultivated and realized by ethics, samadhi, and wisdom. So before we set out on any spiritual path, or any, to my mind, any path of therapy, because we're unhappy, we're dissatisfied, we're feeling ill at ease and mentally distressed. The first point, and this is strongly emphasized in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, is motivation. What is it you want? What's your vision? Why are you going to the therapist? Why are you going to this Tibetan Lama, or this Theravada monk, or this Japanese Roshi? Why are you doing this? Be careful of what you want, you may get it, as we hear in the vernacular. Developing wise desires, a wise vision. I would love to see these 4 vision quests presented to 5-year-olds, and then 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and so forth. And see, what is your vision when you're 5 years old, if you're flourishing? What would make you happy? I asked that to a group of youngsters in elementary school. I was delighted with the responses. And then opening to dialogue, not my telling them, this is what you should have, but just letting them think for themselves. Envision what would make you happy. And then over time, wouldn't it be fascinating to see if you pose this question to a 5-year-old, and then pose it again 5 years later, and 5 years later, 5 years later, how would that vision mature, shift, or does it as time goes by? Maybe when you're 5 years old, it's a bicycle. 10 years old, maybe it's a video game. 15 years old, maybe it's a girlfriend. 20 years old, maybe it's getting a college degree. Or who knows what. But it would be fascinating to see how people do or do not cognitively mature over the course of their lives. And it's by asking questions such as this. What's your vision? In order to realize that what would you love to receive? You can't do it on yourself. You can't do it all by yourself. What help would you love to receive? How would you love to transform? What kind of a person would you love to become? Love to be here and now. And then here we are interacting. You're interacting with me. I'm interacting with you right now. We're all offering something. It may be benevolent. It may be malevolent. It may be neutral. What would give you the greatest satisfaction? The greatest sense of meaning? The word meaning doesn't factor into evolutionary biology. It has no meaning. Genuine well-being has no meaning in this reductionist vision of reality and human existence. That which is most meaningful has no meaning in a physicalist paradigm. So this, I believe, is really an utterly toxic worldview, reducing everything to physical as a worldview. And then when it comes to pursuit of happiness, all you'll think of is hedonism, because you'll think only of looking outside for something that is material or emerges from matter. And then in terms of way of life, well, then it's all consumerism. How much can you consume to get as much hedonic pleasure as possible? So that triad right there, physicalism, hedonism, consumerism, it's like that triad right now that is having a catastrophic influence on the environment, let alone the war and the politics and the malpractices in business and so forth. It's toxic. It's a mental affliction. It is delusion, and the application of delusion by way of values and way of life. So to overcome that, to come up with an alternative that's rooted in reality rather than stupidity, I would love to see children all address that and come up with their own answers. Maybe in dialogue with their parents, their teachers, and so forth. So it's a fourfold vision quest. I continue asking it myself, and I've been around for quite a few decades by now. Let it mature. In Buddhism, what's the culmination of that? Our most passionate, our most fundamental, primal aspiration. In Mahayana Buddhism, may I achieve the perfect awakening of the Buddha, in order to be of greatest possible service to all sentient beings. To my mind, that's the perfection of cognitive wisdom and intelligence.
Since we're limited in time, we will be moderating the questions a little bit, just to make sure we can first get to the more generic ones. So the next question here is from David. Can you say a little bit more about what we may practice or do when compassion tends towards depression when faced with such things as the inability to help change things, for example, in the current war?
I draw so often on actually the first classic text from which I received a word-by-word commentary. It's Shantideva's magnificent classic, A Guide to the Bodhisattva Way of Life, taught to me about almost 50 years ago by Geshe Rinpoche. And one of his pearls of wisdom, and this is in a whole basket full of pearls, is when something comes up over which you have no control and no influence, then why be upset? And if something comes up over which you can exert some benevolent influence, you can do something about it, then why be upset? Our being upset, our being saddened, fearful, depressed, despairing, angry at this vicious invasion of Ukraine. Are somebody being upset? Exactly who gets the benefit of that? Anybody in Ukraine getting any benefit? Any of the conscripted soldiers from Russia who are forced into this, which they never wanted, but cannot escape unless they want to face a long jail term? Are they getting any benefit? The millions of Russians who are appalled at this savage invasion of another country, are they getting any benefit? And so we can do something. In the face of depression, for example, here is a historical event. It had a beginning, it will have an end. Sooner or later, they won't be invading Ukraine indefinitely. It will come to an end, but then there'll be something else. It'll be another pandemic, it'll be another catastrophe, it'll be a global, it'll be environmental, it's going to be one thing after another. Count on it. Count on it. This is called samsara. And so what can we do? At the very least, we can send out our thoughts and aspirations of loving kindness and compassion. The mind is a natural force in nature. It's not just thinking happy thoughts or friendly thoughts. It's a power to be reckoned with because it's rooted in reality. And when we can do something practical, we can make donations. We can offer something tangible to alleviate suffering. Of the Russian soldiers who are dying, Other Ukrainians are having their homes destroyed, invaded, genocided. It's looking in the direction of genocide. If we can do something of practical benefit, do it. But then come back. When you've done what you can, whether it's cultivating loving kindness, extending it, making something tangible to help, then come back. And recognize that all violence is rooted in hatred, which is rooted in delusion, is not reality-based. Come back. Heal your own mind. Fathom your own mind. Cultivate virtue from within. Cultivate peace of mind from within. As deep as you possibly can. And then return to the world again and again and again to come out as an agent of peace, an agent of healing. So there's no reason for despair. Dharma is reality-based. Violence is delusion-based. Given enough time, give enough commitment to Dharma, the truth will prevail. And there I have our deep faith. But not all by itself. We have to cultivate it. We have to realize it. We have to become Buddhas. That's the greatest contribution we can make to the world. Liberate, free your mind of all mental afflictions. Become a Bodhisattva. Proceed along the Bodhisattva path to its culmination, and do so as swiftly as you can. It's this lifetime where humanity is facing the greatest catastrophe in the whole history of humanity. We've done more damage to the world, to our environment. We're rivaling that of the meteor that hit 65 million years ago, and we've done this in a matter of decades. The greatest service we can render. Become Buddhas. Don't leave it to somebody else. Don't leave it just to the Dalai Lama or the Pope or some other great being. We need to become great beings. And the Dharma is the fundamental remedy for all the woes, all the ills of the world. So not only learn it, embody it, realize it. Let your mind become Dharma. And that's our greatest contribution we can ever make. That I say with tremendous confidence.
Another question here is from Tracy. Ontologically, how do we get there at the state of inner balance at a global and societal level? Societal level. Yeah.
His Holiness has often emphasized education, like many other people, and I'm in full agreement with him. This cultivation of mental balance and so forth shouldn't be just in Christian schools, Buddhist schools, Hindu ashrams and so forth and so on. If it were only Buddhists, Hindus, and Christians who are the mischief makers, then we would be the only ones needing it. This should make its way. These basic fundamental principles. What are the inner causes of mental disorders? It's not religion, it's true or false. The Eurocentric, materialistic-based vision of mental health and ill-being is not working out. In fact, as we know, mental illnesses and suicide are on the increase, especially in the so-called developed countries, which we so proudly like to call ourselves in America and Western Europe and so forth. Oh, we're developed. Yeah, we're destroying the environment faster than anybody else. We're very, very developed. And so, education. To present this in a way that is truly secular. His Holiness has written 2 books on secular ethics. Ethics for New Millennium, Beyond Religion. This is for everybody. Nonviolence and benevolence. Cultivating ethics as the foundation, mental balance in ways that no sane person can object to. No sane person can object to. Developing cognitive wisdom and intelligence. What person would be against developing attention skills or greater cognitive clarity? So that especially in democratic countries where we vote in our leaders, we as an electorate don't vote in leaders who are severely mentally imbalanced. And we've done that repeatedly, including in my homeland. Is it not obvious that people should not be running any more than a little hardware store? Maybe software store? Certainly should not be leading a nation because their own mental imbalances are tragic. To have an electorate that votes into office, presidents and people in parliament, in Congress and so forth, who are mentally balanced, requires a mentally balanced electorate. Because if the electorate itself is subject to forms of severe delusion, idolatry and so forth, then they will vote into office people like themselves or worse. And this is happening in multiple countries right now. And then those people get into positions of power, and their highest priority is to hold on to power and increase it. They're mentally ill if they think that is the path to their own or anybody else's well-being. They are cognitively severely impaired. So it's education from very early on age. Not indoctrinating into any religion or ideology. Everything I said here is free of ideology. It's practical. And it's true or false. Everything I said is testable. That's what science should be. Whereas the belief system of physicalism is not scientifically testable because the science itself is embedded in physicalism. And so it's education. That's the short answer. And make it as broad as possible. Reaching out to all kinds of people, religious fundamentalists and atheists, materialists. We all want to be happy, and we can't be happy. No sustainable well-being unless we cultivate our minds. And unless we have some vision of genuine well-being, it can't be just more hedonism and more mundane pleasure, because there's just not enough for all, especially when 8 people right now, 8 individuals on the planet, own as much of the world's assets as the 3.5 or 6 billion people who are living on $1 or 2 a day. 8 people have the same assets as 3.5 billion people. That's not sustainable. That's sick. That's sick. So education. Don't imagine, young children, that if you become as wealthy as these billionaires, that you'll be happier than the next door neighbor, because you won't be. And that goes for power and prestige as well. Get over it. Get over it by the time you're 6. So you think anybody thinks that, they're just stupid. They're just not paying attention. It's education. That's your short answer.
Coming back to the topic of the 4 measurables, a question from Catherine. How would you relate mental balance obtained from the cultivation of the 4 Brahma Vihara and the teaching of the Buddha on non-self?
The teaching on non-self is very often construed by people who just don't understand enough, have not read enough, thought enough, or meditated enough. Because if they think the teaching of non-self means you don't exist, that's delusional. The Buddha never said that. The teachings on non-self in the Buddha Dharma foundational is, if you regard yourself, you think of yourself, you conceive yourself, you feel yourself as someone who's unchanging over time, unitary, the real you, and independent. If you think that's who you are, I'm unchanging, I'm unitary, and I'm autonomous, independent, that self that you're clinging to doesn't exist at all. That's foundational. And if you think you exist that way, you're wrong. And it's not only being wrong, like, oh, I'm wrong about how many planets are there. Is it 9 or is it 10 nowadays? It's wrong in the sense that it's going to screw up your whole life. And it will screw up your view of others as well, thinking they are also unchanging. Oh, you'll never change. I know who you are. I know the real you. And you're certainly not me. You're independent. You're way over there. I'm way over here. You're radically unlike me. You're bad, but I'm actually very good myself. This notion of that sense of self is completely fallacious. And it's catastrophic. It gives rise to craving. Attachment gives rise to hostility and violence. That self is non-existent. How do we exist? By moment, by moment, by moment. And this is empirically demonstrable. You can test this for yourself. Your body, of course, is in a constant state of change. Observe your mind. You see it's constantly changing. The Buddha said there's nothing that changes faster than the mind. Constantly in flux. And there's no separate autonomous you, apart from your body and mind, independent, some individuated self that somehow has this body and mind that are in flux, but it's not. If you believe that, you're delusional. Check it out, see if there's any evidence behind it. Don't just believe Buddhist teachings. So that self doesn't exist. How do we exist? Of course we exist. Of course we exist. The Buddha was an individual. He existed. He spoke of the self, spoke of self-confidence, self-reliance. He spoke of that. You don't use the word self, it doesn't refer to anything at all. How do we exist? We exist constantly in a state of change. We arise in a myriad of ways. Right now I'm arising as a Dharma teacher. At other occasions I'm arising as a spouse, as a friend, as a grandpa, as a stepfather, as a citizen, as a taxpayer, and the list goes on and on. I'm manifesting in a myriad of ways, all of them interrelational, interdependent. not just one. Nothing unchanging, and absolutely not autonomous. As if you could destroy my body and my mind and I'd still be here. Oh, where's my body and my mind? And so we exist in a constant state of flux, fundamental interdependence. And with that insight right there, as we view all those around us arising independently with ourselves, we arising interdependently with them. That's the cognitive basis for empathy. As I suffer, so do you suffer. As I wish for happiness, so do you wish for happiness. Human and non-human alike. This realization of non-self, when it's authentic, actually opens the heart to greater empathy and therefore greater loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and impartiality. Whereas insofar as I'm still grasping to myself as something unchanging, the real me, that was me when I was 5 years old, that was me when I was 10 years old, and so on, immutable, unitary, the real me, not me as the teacher and that, no, the real me behind the scenes, separate and independent. This guts empathy, because then there's no relationship between you and me, subject and object. There's no relationship because we're all autonomous, and that's delusional. So cultivate insight into the impermanence, the interdependence of yourself. It opens the wellsprings of empathy and all the four measurables. And so we decided to be punctual, and I've gone just 1 minute over. I think it's time to close. Thank you for your comments and questions.